The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Marlene Vasquez finally admitted to herself that they had nowhere left to go. She sat in the driver's seat of her rusted 2004 Honda Civic, watching the water stream down the windshield in silver ribbons, her 2 daughters asleep in the back seat beneath a pile of blankets that smelled of mildew and desperation. The parking lot of the abandoned strip mall in Cripple Creek, Colorado, had become their home for the past week, tucked behind a dumpster where the security lights didn't reach, and the occasional police cruiser never bothered to look. It was October, and the temperature was dropping fast. Winter was coming to the mountains, and Marlene knew with a bone-deep certainty that if something didn't change soon, they wouldn't survive it. She was 34 years old, though she felt ancient, worn down to the bone by worry and want. Her hands, once soft and capable, the hands of a woman who had dreamed of becoming a nurse, who had practiced taking blood pressure on her younger sisters, who had believed that hard work and good intentions would be enough, were now cracked and raw from washing dishes at the diner that had let her go 2 weeks ago. Budget cuts, they said. Last hired, first fired. They didn't mention that she was the only one without a permanent address, the only one whose children waited for her in a car in the parking lot because she couldn't afford after-school care. They didn't need to. Marlene understood how the world worked. She had learned that lesson long ago in the small mining town where she'd grown up, watching her mother work herself to exhaustion for people who would never see her as anything more than the help. The windshield wipers had stopped working 2 months ago, and she couldn't afford to fix them. She watched the rain blur the world outside into impressionist smears of grey and black, and she thought about all the things she couldn't afford. A warm room, a hot meal, medicine for Luna's persistent cough, new glasses for Sophia, whose prescription was getting too weak but would have to last another year, another lifetime. In the back seat, 7-year-old Sophia stirred, her small face emerging from the blankets like a flower-seeking light. Her dark eyes found her mother's in the rearview mirror, and in them Marlene saw a question that the child was too young to ask but old enough to feel. "Are we going to be okay?" Marlene forced a smile, the kind of smile that mothers have perfected across millennia, the smile that says everything is fine when everything is falling apart, the smile that hides hunger and fear and the terrible knowledge that you cannot protect the ones you love from a world determined to break them. "Go back to sleep, Mija," Marlene whispered. "We're safe." The lie tasted like copper in her mouth, like blood, like all the other lies she had told to keep her daughters believing in a world that still made sense. They weren't safe. They hadn't been safe for months, not since Marcus had disappeared with their savings and his new girlfriend, not since the landlord had changed the locks while she was at work and dumped their belongings on the curb, not since the shelter had turned them away because they were full, because there were always more desperate people than there were beds, because the world was overflowing with mothers just like her, invisible and struggling and running out of options. The social worker had given her a list of resources, a photocopied sheet with phone numbers that led to voicemails that were never returned. The food bank had given her enough canned goods to last a week, but that week was ending. The last of the peanut butter had been scraped from the jar that morning, spread thin on stale bread for the girls' breakfast. She had told them she wasn't hungry, that she had eaten earlier, that mothers didn't need breakfast the way children did. Another lie. Her stomach was hollow, her head light, her body running on fumes and determination, and the primal refusal to let her children see her break. Beside Sophia, 4-year-old Luna slept with her thumb in her mouth, clutching a stuffed rabbit whose ears had been loved into grey rags. The rabbit's name was Conejita, and Luna had carried it everywhere since she was a baby, through every apartment and every setback and every middle-of-the-night move. Luna still asked when they were going home. Sophia had stopped asking. That silence was worse than any question could have been. It meant her oldest daughter had stopped believing in the lie. It meant Sophia understood. Marlene's phone buzzed. She flinched. Phone calls meant nothing good anymore. Only collection agencies with their scripted threats, automated messages about bills she couldn't pay, wrong numbers from a universe that had forgotten she existed. But when she looked at the screen, she saw an unfamiliar number with a 719 area code, local, Her heart quickened despite herself. Hope was a dangerous thing, a bird with broken wings that insisted on trying to fly. She answered, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Mrs. Vasquez, this is Patricia Holloway from Holloway & Associates. I'm an attorney here in Colorado Springs. I've been trying to reach you for several weeks regarding a matter of some urgency. Is this a good time? A lawyer? Marlene's stomach dropped. More trouble, she thought. More problems she couldn't solve. A lawsuit from Marcus's creditors, maybe, or some forgotten debt from the apartment she'd been evicted from. But the woman's voice was kind, almost gentle, with a warmth that seemed too genuine to be professional courtesy. Something about that gentleness made Marlene want to weep. I don't have any money, Marlene said. Whatever this is about, I can't. Mrs. Vasquez, this isn't about money you owe. It's about money you're owed. Quite a lot of it, actually. And some property. I'm calling about your great-uncle, Esteban Delgado. He passed away 6 weeks ago, and you're named in his will as his sole heir. The name hit Marlene like a physical blow. Esteban Delgado. Her mother's uncle, the man the family never spoke of. The black sheep who had disappeared into the mountains decades ago after some falling out that no one would explain. He was a ghost, a whisper, a photograph in an album that her grandmother had kept hidden in the back of a closet. Marlene had met him exactly once, at her grandmother's funeral when she was 8 years old. She remembered a tall man with silver hair and weathered hands who had stood apart from the other mourners, like a stranger, at his own family's gathering. He had pressed a gold coin into her palm and told her in Spanish that she had her grandmother's eyes, that she should never let anyone take her voice away. I don't understand, Marlene said. I barely knew him. Why would he leave anything to me? That's something I'd prefer to discuss in person, Mrs. Vasquez. The situation is complicated. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? I'm at 247 North Cascade Avenue. I'll have coffee waiting. Marlene looked at the gas gauge. Nearly empty, the needle hovering just above the red zone. She looked at her daughters, sleeping in the back seat, under blankets that weren't warm enough. She looked at the rain, still falling, still cold, still indifferent to her suffering. She thought about the cost of gas, the cost of hope, the cost of believing that something might finally go right. I'll be there, she said. The drive to Colorado Springs took the last of her gas money and most of her remaining courage. Marlene had to choose between filling the tank enough to make the trip or buying breakfast for the girls, so she chose the gas and told Sophia and Luna that they would have a big lunch later, a treat, something special. The lie joined all the other lies she had told them, a growing pile of small deceptions that she hated herself for, even as she spoke them. But what else could she do? What else could any mother do when the truth was too terrible to speak aloud? When the truth was that she didn't know where their next meal would come from, or where they would sleep tonight, or whether the car would make it through another week of cold mountain mornings. Patricia Holloway's office was in a historic building downtown, all red brick and tall windows, the kind of place that spoke of money and stability and everything Marlene had lost. She parked the Civic on a side street, hoping no one would notice the blankets piled in the back seat, or the trash bag of clothes shoved into the trunk, or the fast food wrappers on the floor that testified to too many meals eaten in parking lots. She cleaned the girls' faces with a wet wipe, smoothed their hair with trembling fingers, tried to make them presentable. Sophia watched her mother's hands, with those knowing eyes, understanding more than any 7-year-old should have to understand. The child had learned to read her mother's moods, to gauge the depth of their trouble by the tension in Marlene's shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. Mama, Luna said, tugging at Marlene's sleeve with small fingers. I'm hungry. My tummy hurts. I know, baby. Soon, I promise. The receptionist led them to a conference room where Patricia Holloway was waiting, a woman in her 60s with steel grey hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple navy suit that managed to look both professional and approachable, and when she smiled, the lines around her eyes deepened in a way that spoke of genuine warmth rather than practiced courtesy. True to her word, there was coffee on the table, and pastries too, croissants and muffins and little cups of fruit, more food than Marlene had seen in one place in weeks. Marlene watched her daughter's eyes go wide at the sight of all that abundance, and she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from crying. "Please help yourselves," Patricia said, gesturing to the spread. "I always order too much. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." The girls looked at Marlene for permission, and she nodded, not trusting her voice. They descended on the pastries with a hunger that made Patricia's expression flicker with something like pain, the recognition of want, the understanding of what it meant when children ate like that, quickly and completely, as if the food might disappear. The lawyer busied herself with papers while the children ate, giving them time, giving Marlene time to compose herself, to push down the shame that rose in her throat like bile. "Mrs. Vasquez," Patricia began, when Sophia and Luna were settled with full bellies and colouring books the receptionist had provided. "What do you know about your great-uncle's history?" "Almost nothing. My mother never talked about him. I know there was some kind of fight, some falling out, but I was never told the details." She would get this look on her face whenever his name came up. Not angry exactly, but closed off, like a door slamming shut. "I met him once at my grandmother's funeral. That's all." Patricia nodded slowly, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Esteban Delgado was, by all accounts, an extraordinary man. He was a mining engineer, educated at the Colorado School of Mines back in the 1960s, one of the few Mexican-American students in his class, which tells you something about his determination. He worked for several of the big mining companies, made a name for himself as someone who knew the rock, who could read a mountain the way other men read books. But he was also difficult, principled, some would say, stubborn, others might argue. He had a habit of speaking truth to power, of refusing to look the other way when he saw things he didn't like. What kind of things? Unsafe working conditions, environmental violations, wage theft, the usual sins of the industry, the kind that everyone knew about, but nobody wanted to talk about. But there was one incident in particular, back in 1978, that changed everything. Esteban was working for Thornton Mining Corporation when there was an accident at one of their operations. A tunnel collapse. 12 men died. Marlene felt a chill run down her spine, a cold finger tracing the bones of her back. She had heard whispers of this, fragments of a story her mother had told her once, late at night, when the tequila had loosened her tongue and the grief had loosened her secrets. Something about a mine, about men who died, about a truth that had torn the family apart and could never be spoken aloud. Esteban claimed the collapse wasn't an accident, Patricia continued. He said the company had ignored his safety reports, that they knew the tunnel was unstable, but pushed ahead anyway, because they were racing to meet a quota. The deadline mattered more than the men. He tried to go public with what he knew, but Thornton was powerful, the kind of powerful that could make problems disappear. They had lawyers, politicians, journalists in their pocket. They destroyed his career, blacklisted him from the industry. Worse, they turned his own family against him. How? Your grandmother's husband, your grandfather, worked for Thornton. He was a foreman, a company man to his bones. He sided with the people who paid his salary, who provided his pension. He forced the family to choose between him and Esteban. Most of them chose him. Your mother, who was just a teenager at the time, was forbidden from ever speaking to Esteban again. The family split down the middle, and it never healed. The weight of this history settled on Marlene's shoulders, like a physical burden, like stones being placed one by one until she could barely stand. She thought of her mother, who had died 3 years ago of a heart that simply gave out, still carrying the scars of that division. She thought of her grandmother, who had always seemed sad in a way that went deeper than words, who had cried when Esteban came to the funeral, who had held his hand for a long moment before letting go, as if releasing something precious that she could never reclaim. What happened to Esteban after that? He disappeared into the mountains, bought a piece of land near Victor, up in the old mining district where fortunes had been made and lost a century ago. Everyone assumed he was just a bitter old man, living out his days alone, nursing his grievances. But Esteban was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He spent 40 years up there, Mrs. Vasquez, 40 years exploring, surveying, documenting, 40 years of patience, and somewhere along the way, he found something. Patricia slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, yellowed documents, hand-drawn maps covered in careful notations, images of rock formations and tunnel entrances that looked ancient and forgotten. He found gold, Mrs. Vasquez, not just traces, not just enough to pan for hobby money in a stream, a vein, a significant, untapped vein running through an old mine shaft on his property, a shaft that everyone else had written off as exhausted 100 years ago. He spent decades confirming it, mapping it, documenting every detail. Marlene stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Gold, an inheritance, from a man she barely knew who had been cast out of the family for telling the truth. How much? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Based on the geological surveys Esteban conducted and the samples he had assayed over the years, conservative estimates put the value of the gold still in that mine at somewhere between $8 and $12 million. The room tilted. The air seemed to thicken, to press against Marlene's chest. She gripped the edge of the table, certain she had misheard, certain this was some cruel joke or a dream from which she would wake in the back seat of her car with her daughters hungry and the rain still falling. In the corner, Sophia looked up from her colouring book, sensing her mother's distress, with the radar that children develop when their world becomes uncertain. But there's a complication, Patricia said, and her voice had gone careful, measured, the voice of someone delivering difficult news. There always is in cases like this. Thornton Mining Corporation still exists. They've been bought and sold a few times, restructured, renamed. They're called Thornton Resources now, and they're run by the grandson of the man who destroyed Esteban's career. His name is Harrison Thornton III, and he's been trying to buy that land for years. The property was 45 minutes outside of Victor, up a winding dirt road that tested the limits of Marlene's aging Civic and her fraying nerves. The land spread across 60 acres of pine forest and rocky meadow, wild and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. The old mineshaft entrance was visible at the base of a granite cliff, a dark mouth in the grey rock that had been waiting for someone to find its secrets. There was a cabin too, small, weathered, but sturdy, where Esteban had lived alone for 4 decades, surrounded by his books and his maps and his patience. Patricia had given Marlene the keys, along with a warning. Harrison Thornton had already made several offers on the property, each one more aggressive than the last. When Esteban was alive, he had refused them all with the stubbornness of a man who knew exactly what he had, and exactly what it was worth. Now, with a new owner, one who was clearly in desperate circumstances, who had driven up in a car held together by rust and prayers, Thornton would almost certainly try again. "Be careful," Patricia had said. "These people don't like to hear the word no. They're not used to it." But standing here now, in the thin mountain air that tasted of pine and possibility, with Sophia and Luna exploring the cabin's small porch like archaeologists discovering a new world, Marlene felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Not certainty, not confidence. Those were luxuries she couldn't afford. Not yet. But hope, that small and stubborn thing, that refusal to give up even when giving up, seemed like the only rational choice. The same hope that had kept her going through the shelter rejections and the job losses, and the nights when the cold crept through the car windows, and she wondered if she would ever feel warm again. The cabin was exactly what she had expected, and nothing like what she had imagined. It was humble, a single main room with a wood stove and a small kitchen, a bedroom barely big enough for a bed, a bathroom with plumbing that groaned and coughed but worked. The furniture was old but solid, hand-built from local timber by hands that knew their craft. The walls were lined with bookshelves stuffed with volumes on geology, mining history, and Colorado law, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent preparing for a fight that might never come. But it was the desk by the window that drew Marlene's attention, pulled her across the room like a magnet. It was covered with papers, letters, documents, photographs, maps drawn with meticulous care, Esteban's life work, laid out in careful stacks that told a story of obsession and dedication, and the patient certainty that someday someone would come to finish what he had started. She spent that first night reading by candlelight while the girls slept in the bedroom, wrapped in quilts that smelled of cedar and age. She learned about the 1978 collapse, the real story, not the official version that had been printed in newspapers, and repeated until it became truth. She read the names of the men who had died: Manuel Rodriguez, James Whitehorse, Samuel Keene, Thomas Garcia, Miguel Santos, William Blackbear, Robert Quinn, David Two Rivers, Frank Martinez, Joseph Eaglefeather, Benjamin Cruz, Antonio Delgado, Esteban's younger brother, her great-great-uncle, dead at 32, in a tunnel that should never have been opened, that Esteban had warned was unstable, that the company had pushed into anyway, because the deadline mattered more than the men. Now she understood. Now she understood why Esteban had fought so hard, why he had sacrificed everything: his career, his family, his place in the world. It wasn't just about safety reports and corporate negligence. It was about his brother, buried under tons of rock because rich men had decided that quota numbers mattered more than human lives. It was personal. It was love transformed into a 45-year vigil. She found the geological surveys next, detailed maps of the mine shaft with notations in Esteban's careful handwriting. He had spent years exploring the abandoned tunnels, documenting every vein, every promising formation. The gold was real. She could see that clearly in the assay reports, the lab results, the photographs of ore samples glinting in lamplight like captured stars. But there was something else in those papers, something that made Marlene's blood run cold. Letters from Thornton Resources, dating back 20 years. Polite at first, then insistent, then threatening. Offers to buy the land at far below market value. Veiled references to difficulties that could arise if Esteban didn't cooperate. Legal threats about property boundaries and mineral rights. And between the lines, the implicit promise that they would make his life miserable until he gave them what they wanted. And, in a locked box at the bottom of a drawer, a handwritten letter that changed everything. Dear Marlene, it began, in handwriting that was steady despite the years. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the burden I have carried for 45 years now falls to you. I am sorry for this weight I leave you. I am sorry that I never knew you, that I was not allowed to be part of your life, that I could only watch from a distance as you grew into the woman your grandmother always knew you would become. But I kept track, I watched. I know that you're strong, like your grandmother. I know that you're good, like your mother was before the world taught her to be afraid. The gold in this mine is worth a fortune, but it is not the most valuable thing I leave you. In the safe behind the bookshelf, you will find documents, original safety reports, internal memos, testimony from workers who were threatened into silence, proof that Thornton Mining knew the tunnel was unstable, proof that they murdered my brother and 11 other men to meet a deadline. Harrison Thornton II paid millions to bury this truth. His grandson will pay more to keep it buried, but some things are worth more than money. Some truths must be told, whatever the cost. I trust you to know what to do. With love, your Tio Esteban. Marlene found the safe exactly where the letter said it would be, hidden behind a false panel in the bookshelf. Inside were boxes of documents, meticulously organized and preserved. Internal memos from 1978, stamped confidential. Reports marked with red flags that had been ignored. Affidavits from former Thornton employees, notarized and witnessed by attorneys who had since died. Cassette tapes labelled with dates and names. A secretary's diary, written in a careful hand. She held the proof of a 45-year-old crime in her hands, and she understood at last why Esteban had chosen her. Not because she was his only living relative, not because he felt sorry for her, but because she was the only one who had nothing left to lose, because she was desperate enough to fight and stubborn enough to win. They came 3 days later while Marlene was teaching Sophia how to start a fire in the wood stove. A black SUV with tinted windows, followed by a silver Mercedes that looked absurdly out of place on the rutted mountain road, its chrome trim splattered with mud. Men in suits emerged, their Italian shoes immediately muddied, their expressions sour with distaste for the wilderness around them. The man who climbed out of the Mercedes was different. He was younger than she expected, mid-40s perhaps, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of artificial tan that came from expensive vacations in places where people like Marlene were invisible. He wore a cashmere coat that probably cost more than every piece of clothing Marlene had ever owned combined, and a watch that glinted gold in the pale mountain sunlight. His smile was perfect, practiced, as warm as a glacier and about as welcoming. "Mrs. Vasquez," he extended his hand. "Harrison Thornton, I hope we're not intruding. I heard about old Esteban passing. Tragic, really, and I wanted to come by personally to offer my condolences. And, if you have a moment, to discuss the future of this property." Marlene did not take his hand. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, one arm around Sophia, watching this man who had inherited a fortune built on the bodies of dead miners. She thought of her great-great-uncle Antonio, buried under tons of rock. She thought of the memos she had read, the ones that proved the company had known, had been warned, had decided that the deadline mattered more than the men. "Mr. Thornton, I know who you are. I know what your family did." The smile flickered, just for a moment, like a mask slipping. "I see. The old man filled your head with stories, did he? Look, Mrs. Vasquez, I understand that Esteban had grievances. Some of them may have even been legitimate, but that was a long time ago. Different management, different standards, different era. I'm not here to relitigate the past. I'm here to offer you a very generous deal for this land." "What kind of deal?" $500,000. Cash, enough to set you and your daughters up for life. A fresh start, somewhere nice. California, maybe. I hear the weather's lovely. He glanced at the cabin, at the rusted Civic parked in the drive, at the worn clothes Marlene was wearing. This place isn't exactly hospitable, especially not for children. Winter up here is brutal. No place for a single mother trying to make ends meet. Marlene felt Sophia press closer to her side. The girl was listening, understanding more than Thornton realized. Children always understood, more than adults gave them credit for. "The land is worth millions," Marlene said. "The gold alone—" "Ah," Thornton's smile sharpened, became something predatory. "So he told you about that too? Well, let me give you some free advice, Mrs. Vasquez. Mining is an expensive business. Permitting environmental impact studies, extraction equipment, labour, it takes millions to get millions out of the ground. Do you have millions lying around? Because I do. And without my resources, that gold might as well be on the moon. I'll find investors. You'll try, and you'll discover that nobody in this industry will touch a deal that puts them on the wrong side of Thornton Resources. We have a long memory, Mrs. Vasquez. So did your great-uncle. I'd hoped that stubbornness wasn't hereditary." He took a step closer, and now the mask had slipped entirely. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by something cold and calculating, the look of a man who had never been told no and didn't intend to start accepting it now. The look of a man who saw other people as obstacles to be removed. "Take the money," he said quietly, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "Take it and disappear, because if you try to fight me, I will bury you. Not with lawyers, though I have plenty of those. Not with money, though I have plenty of that too. I'll bury you with the same thing my grandfather used on Esteban. The truth, or at least the version of it that my PR team decides to tell. Single mother, homeless, desperate, trying to scam millions out of a legitimate business with forged documents from a dead crazy man. How do you think that story plays in the press? In family court? How do you think it affects your custody?" The threat hung in the air like poison. Marlene felt her heart stop, restart race. Her children. He was threatening to take her children. The one thing she had left. The one thing she would die to protect. "Mama?" Sophia's voice was small, frightened. "Who is this man? Why is he being mean?" Marlene looked down at her daughter, then back at Harrison Thornton, and something in her shifted. Something hardened into steel. She'd been afraid for so long. Afraid of hunger, afraid of cold, afraid of the world that seemed designed to crush people like her. But there were worse things than fear. There was cowardice. There was letting men like this win. There was teaching her daughters that the powerful could always take what they wanted, that the truth didn't matter, that the only choice was to submit. "Leave my property," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "Now!" Thornton stared at her for a long moment, something flickering in his eyes that might have been surprise or might have been respect. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound, without humour. "Your funeral," he said. "Literally, if you're not careful. These old mines are dangerous. Accidents happen all the time." He turned and walked back to his Mercedes, his entourage trailing behind. Marlene watched them drive away, the dust settling in their wake. And then she went inside, locked the door, and held her daughters until her hands stopped shaking. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Marlene's life, and that was saying something, given what she had already survived. Thornton's threat had not been idle. Suddenly every door she tried to open was closed. The bank that was supposed to provide bridge financing backed out without explanation. The loan officer's voice, tight with apology, he couldn't explain. The mining engineer Patricia had recommended stopped returning calls. Even the local grocery store owner, who had been friendly enough at first, began giving her suspicious looks and short answers. Worse, the whispers had started. Marlene heard them at the gas station, at the post office, in the aisles of the hardware store where she bought supplies for the cabin. A crazy woman, they said, a con artist, claiming to have inherited a gold mine. Can you believe it? And those poor children, dragged into this mess by a mother who couldn't tell the difference between fantasy and reality. The Thornton machine was working exactly as Harrison had promised. The truth was being buried, one lie at a time, one whisper at a time, one closed door at a time. But Marlene had one advantage that Thornton hadn't counted on. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. She had already survived the worst. She had already faced hunger and cold and desperation. She knew how to fight when fighting seemed impossible. She knew how to keep going when the world wanted her to give up. She began reaching out to the families of the 12 men who had died in the 1978 collapse. It wasn't easy. 45 years had scattered them across the country, and many of the original witnesses were dead. But she found their children, their grandchildren, people who had grown up with the same questions she now had, people who remembered fathers and uncles and brothers who never came home. She found Rosa Whitehorse in Phoenix, whose father James had been the youngest man in that tunnel, just 23 years old with a baby on the way. She found Samuel Keene Jr. in Denver, still carrying his father's pocket watch, the one that had been recovered from the rubble. She found Elena Rodriguez in Pueblo, who wept when Marlene showed her the memos that proved her husband Manuel's death had been preventable, that the company had known, and had pushed ahead anyway. One by one, they agreed to stand with her. One by one, they added their voices to hers. 12 families, united by grief and anger and the promise of justice too long denied. Patricia Holloway, working pro bono now because she had grown to admire Marlene's stubborn courage, found a journalist, a young woman named Grace Chen, from the Denver Post, hungry and idealistic and immune to Thornton's influence. It turned out Grace had her own connection to the story. Her grandmother Margaret had been a secretary at Thornton Mining in 1978, had kept a diary of what she witnessed, had lived the rest of her life haunted by what she knew and couldn't tell. Grace spent a week at the cabin, going through Esteban's documents, interviewing the families, building a story that would be impossible to bury. The meeting was arranged through lawyers, Thornton's army of corporate attorneys, facing Patricia Holloway across a mahogany table in a Denver office that looked like it had been decorated by someone who confused expense with taste. Crystal chandeliers, leather chairs, original artwork that probably cost more than the median American home. Harrison Thornton sat at the head of the table like a king on his throne, flanked by advisors who took notes on tablets and whispered in his ear. Marlene sat across from him, alone except for Patricia. She had left the girls with Rosa Whitehorse, who had driven up from Phoenix to help. She had dressed carefully, not to impress, but to remind herself that she was not the desperate, broken woman Thornton thought she was. She was the heir of Esteban Delgado. She was the voice of 12 dead men. She was a mother fighting for her children's future. Mrs. Vasquez, Thornton's smile was back, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm glad you came to your senses. My offer still stands. 500,000, and we can all move on with our lives. I didn't come here to accept your offer, Mr. Thornton. I came here to make one of my own. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a summary of Esteban's documents, a timeline of the 1978 collapse, and a draft of the article Grace Chen had written. Your grandfather knew the tunnel was unstable. He had reports, from my great-uncle, from other engineers, warning him that the support structures were inadequate. He ignored them because stopping work would have cost money and delayed the extraction quota. 12 men died because of that decision. Your family has spent 45 years covering it up. Thornton's face had gone very still. He didn't touch the folder. "Ancient history," he said. "Hearsay and speculation from a bitter old man. You think anyone is going to believe documents that have been sitting in a cabin for 40 years? I think they will when they hear the recordings." She saw the blood drain from his face, and she knew in that moment that Esteban had been right about everything. The recordings existed. Thornton knew they existed, and he knew what was on them. "Your grandfather was smart," Marlene continued, her voice steady as stone. "He destroyed most of the evidence, but Esteban was smarter. He made copies, he recorded conversations, he had a witness, a secretary named Margaret Chen, Grace Chen's grandmother, as it happens, who kept a diary. It's all there, Mr. Thornton. Every lie, every payoff, every threat. Your grandfather on tape, admitting that he knew the tunnel would collapse. Acceptable losses, he called them. 12 men. Acceptable losses." The lawyers were whispering urgently now, but Thornton wasn't listening. He was staring at Marlene as if seeing her for the first time. Not as a desperate homeless woman to be bullied and dismissed, but as an adversary, a threat, someone who held his future in her hands. "What do you want?" His voice had lost its smooth confidence. It was raw now, frightened. 3 things. First, a public acknowledgement of what happened in 1978, the truth, finally told, with a formal apology to the families of the victims. Second, a settlement fund for those families, $10 million, to be distributed equally. Third, you leave me and my property alone. No more offers, no more threats, no more whisper campaigns. I keep the mine, I develop it on my own terms, and you never speak my name again. That's blackmail. No, Mr. Thornton, that's justice. Blackmail would be if I asked for money for myself. I'm not asking for anything that isn't owed. The families deserve compensation. The public deserves the truth, and I deserve to be left in peace to raise my daughters and honour my great-uncle's memory. Thornton's hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists, hiding them beneath the table. "And if I refuse? Then Grace Chen's article runs tomorrow. Front page of the Denver Post, picked up by national outlets within hours. Your stock price crashes. Your board demands your resignation. The lawsuits start. Maybe criminal charges, if prosecutors get interested in what else they might find in your family's closet." Marlene leaned forward, and her voice was steady as stone. "I grew up poor, Mr. Thornton. I know how to survive with nothing. Do you?" The silence stretched for a long moment. Thornton looked at his lawyers, at the folder in front of him, at the woman who had walked into his office with nothing but the truth, and was about to walk out with everything. "I need time to consider," he said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning. After that, Grace makes her calls." Marlene stood, gathered her things, and walked out of the office without looking back. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the room, the transfer of power from the man who had everything to the woman who had found something more valuable than gold. She had found the truth, and the truth, as it turned out, was worth more than any fortune. 18 months later, Marlene Vasquez stood at the entrance of the Delgado Memorial Mine, watching a crane lower a bronze plaque into place. The plaque bore the names of the 12 men who had died in the 1978 collapse, along with a simple inscription, "Remembered in truth, honoured in justice." Behind her, the families had gathered, children and grandchildren of the victims, come from across the country to witness this moment. Rosa Whitehorse stood with her arm around Elena Rodriguez, both women weeping quietly. Samuel Keene Jr. held his father's pocket watch, running his thumb over the worn brass. Grace Chen was there too, photographing everything for the follow-up story she was writing, her grandmother Margaret's diary tucked safely in her bag. Harrison Thornton had accepted the deal. He'd had no choice in the end. The recordings, the documents, Margaret Chen's testimony, it was too much to bury, too damning to spin. Thornton Resources had issued a public apology, established the settlement fund, and quietly begun divesting from mining operations in Colorado. Harrison himself had stepped down as CEO, citing a desire to spend more time with family. The business press had speculated about health problems or internal conflicts, but Grace Chen knew the truth, and she had published every word of it. The story had run on the front page of the Denver Post, been picked up by the New York Times, gone viral on social media. Marlene had given exactly one interview, calm and dignified, telling the story of her great-uncle's 45-year fight for justice. She had become, briefly and unwillingly, famous, the homeless single mother who had taken on a corporate dynasty and won. But fame had never been what she wanted. What she wanted was standing beside her now. Sophia and Luna, healthy and happy, enrolled in the local school, making friends, learning to ski, growing up in the mountains their ancestors had once called home. The mine was operational now, run by a cooperative that Marlene had established with help from Patricia Holloway and a consortium of ethical investors. The gold was being extracted carefully, sustainably, with workers paid fair wages and safety protocols that would have made Esteban proud. Half the profits went to the families of the original victims. Another portion funded a scholarship program for the children of miners. Marlene kept only what she needed, enough to maintain the cabin, to support her daughters, to live simply and well in the place where her great-uncle had spent his final years. She had renovated the cabin not into something grand but into something comfortable. A proper kitchen with a stove that didn't need coaxing, a bedroom for each of the girls, decorated with their drawings and treasures. Bookshelves filled with the volumes Esteban had collected, now joined by new books. Sophia's beloved chapter books, Luna's picture books, textbooks from the nursing program Marlene had finally enrolled in at the community college in Colorado Springs. On the mantel above the wood stove sat two photographs, one of Esteban and Antonio, taken before the collapse, two brothers with their arms around each other's shoulders, smiling into a future they couldn't have imagined, and one of Marlene with Sophia and Luna, taken last summer, all three of them laughing at something the photographer had said. "Mama," Sophia tugged at Marlene's sleeve. At 8.5 now, she had grown tall and confident, her shy watchfulness transformed into thoughtful intelligence. "Is it time for the ceremony?" Marlene nodded, taking her daughter's hand. Luna grabbed the other, bouncing on her heels with 5-year-old energy. Together, the three of them walked to the front of the gathering, where Patricia Holloway was waiting to introduce the speakers. The family spoke first, Samuel Keene Jr. reading the names of the 12, Rosa Whitehorse sharing memories of a father she had never known, Elena Rodriguez singing a Spanish hymn in a voice that cracked with emotion but never faltered. Then Grace Chen read a passage from her grandmother's diary, words written in secret, nearly half a century ago, by a woman brave enough to bear witness. Finally, it was Marlene's turn. She stepped forward, feeling the weight of all those eyes, all those hopes, all that history pressing down on her shoulders. She thought of Esteban, alone in his cabin, waiting for someone to find the truth he had preserved. She thought of her mother, who had never been allowed to speak to him, who had carried that silence to her grave. She thought of her grandmother, who had held his hand at that funeral and said goodbye to a brother she had been forced to betray. She thought of Sophia and Luna and the world they would inherit, a world where the truth had finally been told, where justice had finally been done. 45 years ago, she began, her voice steady. 12 men went into a mine shaft and never came out. Their families were told it was an accident. They were told it was nobody's fault. They were told to be grateful for the small settlements they received, and to never ask questions, and to move on with their lives. But the truth doesn't move on. The truth waits. It waited in a cabin in the mountains, in boxes of documents that one man refused to destroy, in recordings and letters and memories that refused to fade. It waited for someone to find it, to tell it, to make it matter. She paused, looking out at the faces before her, old and young, grief-weathered and hopeful, all of them connected by loss and bound together by this moment of reckoning. My great-uncle Esteban spent his life fighting for that truth. He was called a liar, a troublemaker, a crazy old man. He lost everything, his career, his family, his place in the world. But he never stopped believing that someday the truth would come out. Someday justice would be done. Someday the men who died in that tunnel would be remembered not as acceptable losses, but as fathers and brothers and sons whose lives mattered, whose lives still matter. She looked down at her daughters. Sophia was watching her with fierce pride. Luna was holding the hand of Elena Rodriguez's granddaughter, two children who would grow up knowing this story, carrying this truth into the future. This mine was built on the labor of men who deserved better. It will operate on their memory. Every ounce of gold that comes out of this mountain will be extracted with safety and dignity. Or not at all. That is the promise we make today, to the 12 who died and to all who come after. We remember, we honor, we do better. The applause started slowly, building until it echoed off the granite cliffs. Marlene stepped back, and her daughters rushed into her arms. And for a moment, one perfect, luminous moment, everything that had been broken was whole again. Later that evening, after the families had said their goodbyes and the sun had begun to set behind the mountains, Marlene sat on the cabin porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn gold. The girls were inside, working on homework, their voices rising and falling in the comfortable rhythm of sisters. She thought about the woman she had been 18 months ago, cold, hungry, terrified, sleeping in a car with her children while the rain fell and the world felt like an enemy. She thought about the coin Esteban had pressed into her palm at her grandmother's funeral, still sitting in a drawer in the cabin. She thought about the choices that had led her here, the suffering and the struggle and the stubborn refusal to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only option. She had learned something in those dark months, something precious and terrible and true. There was no one coming to save her. No hero, no miracle, no lottery ticket redemption. There was only herself and her children, and the choice to keep moving forward one step at a time, one breath at a time, one impossible day at a time. And then there had been Esteban's inheritance, not just the gold, not just the land, but the truth, the proof that justice was possible, even when it took 45 years to arrive. The evidence that one person's stubborn courage could outlast the lies of powerful men, could survive the silence of generations, could change the world for people not yet born. Marlene Vasquez had inherited a forgotten mineshaft, and what was hidden inside had indeed been worth millions. But the real treasure wasn't the gold. It never had been. The real treasure was the truth, preserved, protected, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring it into the light. The real treasure was justice, not perfect, not complete, but real and lasting and hard-won. The real treasure was the daughters inside, safe and warm and loved, who would grow up knowing that their mother had faced the worst the world could offer and had refused to break. The sun slipped below the mountains and the first stars appeared, cold and bright in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. The wind moved through the pines like a whisper, like a promise, like the voice of a man who had waited 45 years for someone to listen. Marlene closed her eyes and let the peace of this moment wash over her. She had survived. She had fought. She had won. And tomorrow she would do what she had always done. Wake up, love her children, tell the truth, and keep moving forward. Because that was what mothers did. That was what mothers had always done. Across all the ages of the world, they endured, they protected, they fought for their children's futures with a ferocity that no fortune could buy and no power could break. The gold in the mountain was worth millions. The love of a mother was worth everything else.